She said leave. He rode back at dawn and she was still waiting. The deed was in my coat pocket when I walked out. Folded 3 times, creased so hard along those folds that the paper had gone soft as cloth. I'd carried it there since the bank man handed it over 3 weeks prior, maybe 4, and I'd pressed my hand against it through the wool every morning the way a man touches a sore tooth. Not because it made him feel better, because he can't stop. 42 years old, and everything I owned fit in a saddlebag, and a deed that wasn't worth the county's ink. That's the honest start of it, not some moment of glory, not a story that opens clean. It opens with me walking out of a woman's kitchen before first light, boots in my hand so I wouldn't wake her, and a piece of folded paper pressed against my ribs like a wound I'd stopped trying to dress. I got about 40 yards. I was standing in the dark yard with frost on the ground, holding my boots, and I looked back at the house. The kitchen window had lamplight in it, which meant she was already up, which meant she'd heard me go and had chosen to light the lamp anyway instead of calling me back. That's the kind of woman she was. I stood there in the cold for a long minute. Then I put my boots on. There was no point in being theatrical about it. The ground was frozen, and I went back inside. Her name was Clara Ames. I'll get to the middle part in a moment. I need to get to it right, which means I need to start further back. I came down from Colorado Territory in October, which is late to be moving, and I knew it. Had been a claims assessor out of Denver before that railroad work, the kind where you ride ahead of the survey teams and flag land for acquisition, do the preliminary measurements, write the reports that the company lawyers turn into offers, and the landowners mostly accept because the alternative is eminent domain. Good pay, steady, and it suited me because it was solitary. You ate alone, slept alone, made your decisions with no one looking over your shoulder. I'd been at it 9 years. If you'd asked me whether I was content, I probably would have said something like, it's fine. Which is what a man says when he's stopped asking himself the question honestly. Before the railroad work, I'd been married. Her name was Frances from Topeka, a sensible woman who made the error of believing a restless man will settle once he has someone to settle for. I wasn't cruel to her, wasn't unfaithful. I was just gone. A month here, 6 weeks there, and when I came home I was still elsewhere in my head, thinking about the next departure the way a horse turned toward the barn will pull at any rein that tries to slow it. She waited 3 years. Then she left a letter from Montana saying she was going back to Topeka and wished me well. She didn't know what I was looking for. Neither did I. That was the problem. After she left, I stopped going home at all. Kept a room in a Denver boarding house, was there maybe 2 months in 12. I had a trunk I never unpacked. I'd learned to carry everything that mattered in a saddlebag, which sounds lean and capable until you realize it also means you've got nothing that doesn't fit in a saddlebag, and that's a small life when you hold it up to the light. The railroad work dried up in late summer of that year. There was a dispute between 2 survey companies over a corridor near Trinidad, and they froze all field operations while the lawyers argued it out in Denver. I had some money saved, not enough. I had a horse named Cobb, a big ugly roan with a white face and one wall eye that gave him a permanent look of mild surprise, and I had a claim on a piece of scrubland northeast of Raton Pass that I'd taken in lieu of back wages from a survey foreman who'd offered it like it was a favor. 40 acres, decent grass, good water access. Except I'd later found out the foreman had a lien against the property he hadn't mentioned, which meant the deed I was carrying was legitimate in form and suspect in substance. And the county records were a tangle I didn't have the energy or the legal standing to straighten out without a lawyer I couldn't afford. So, a horse, a bad deed, and 42 years of being good at a job that didn't exist anymore. I came south because south was warmer, because Raton was in that direction, and the land was nominally mine, and I had some vague idea of dealing with it. Because I had nowhere else in particular to be, and a man with nowhere to be will ride toward a thing on the horizon just to have somewhere to point. The way I ended up at Clara Ames's station is not a romantic story. My horse threw a shoe 2 miles east of her place on an afternoon when the sky had turned that particular gray that means business. Not a storm gray, but a blank settled gray, the kind that's not in a hurry. I walked Cobb in. The station was a good-sized operation, main house, stock barn, a smaller outbuilding for harness and a forge, a long water trough, 3 paddocks. Everything looked maintained, which isn't always true of stage stations. This place looked like someone actually paid attention to it. Clara was in the yard splitting wood, doing it herself, clean, efficient strokes, the splits flying off and landing in a rough line to her right. She looked up when she heard Cobb's three-legged walk on the road, assessed the horse, assessed me, put the axe down. "Shoe or leg," she said. "Shoe. Pull him around back. Forge is in the barn." She went back to the wood. That was the entire welcome. I rashad Cobb myself, which took about an hour. When I came out, she was finishing stacking the splits against the south wall, neat rows, the kind you build when you're thinking about winter rather than just about getting through the afternoon. She didn't look up until I'd cleared my throat. I asked what I owed for the use of the forge. "Where are you headed?" I told her I wasn't sure. She studied me, not sizing me up for what I might be useful for, something more direct, like she was deciding whether to say something she'd already thought of. "I need someone who can handle horses and is handy with repairs, more work than my daughter and I can manage before the snow comes." She named a wage. Fair, not generous, but fair. Room and board, no obligation past the season. I almost said no. I don't know why I didn't, except that Cobb needed a few days off his feet and the gray sky was making good on its promise. The first flakes came down while we were standing there. "All right," I said. She nodded, went inside. That was the whole negotiation. Her daughter was Ruth, 15, with her mother's directness and none of her patience yet. She watched me from a distance the first 2 weeks with an expression that reminded me, as I mentioned, of a horse reading the weather. Not hostile, not welcoming, just observant and withholding judgment. The station ran on a schedule Clara had built over years. Stage through every 3 days from the east, every 4 from the west, the times varying by season and road conditions. 2 regular freight wagons per week, occasional private travelers. Each transit meant fresh water, feed if needed, a team change if the driver wanted one, and whatever the manifest required in terms of supplies. Between transits there was maintenance, always maintenance, the kind that never ends on a working property, the list that grows faster than you can work it down. Clara kept a ledger. She noted everything. On my 3rd day, she handed me a list of deferred repairs without preamble and said, "In order of season, the first 6 matter most before the hard freeze." I looked at the list, 12 items detailed with materials noted. She'd clearly been keeping it for a while. I started on the gates that afternoon. In the first month, I rehung 3 gates that had been swinging wrong, drifting on worn pins until they hung at an angle that meant they were always either dragging the ground or failing to latch. I rebuilt the front wall of the stock barn where the foundation had shifted, had to pull 3 courses of stone, relay them level, reset the timbers above. I dug out a drainage channel on the north side of the house that had been pooling water since, from the look of the rot along the foundation sill, about 1882. I replaced the latch on the harness room, rehung 2 windows that had warped in their frames, caulked the seams on the north-facing wall of the house against the wind, and repaired the iron bracket that held the water trough's overflow pipe in place. I did not ask for praise, and I did not receive it, and that suited me exactly. Clara ran the station with a precision I hadn't seen in a man or a woman. She didn't talk unless there was something to say, never said a thing twice. She knew every horse's name and particular temperaments, which mare wouldn't be touched on the left shoulder, which gelding needed approaching from the right. When the stage came through, she was ready before it arrived, and when it left, she was back at work before the dust settled. She was, in the narrowest definition, competent, except I don't mean it in the faint praise sense. I mean the rare kind, where you realize watching it that most of what passes for competence is just getting by. Ruth came around slowly. About 2 weeks in, when I was working on the drainage ditch, cold, tedious work, the ground was already stiff. She walked over and stood at the edge and watched me for a moment. Then she said, "My father died in April." "Your mother mentioned it," I said. "She doesn't mention things very often." "No," I kept digging. "She told me he was a good man." Ruth was quiet for a moment. He was also gone a lot the last few years, the railroad." She paused. "She's been doing everything herself since April. Before that, too, mostly, he wasn't well." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say. She watched me dig for a while longer. Then, "Are you planning to stay past winter?" "I don't know yet." She made a sound that wasn't quite a verdict and went back to the house. But after that, she stopped watching me like weather and started watching me like an arithmetic problem. like she was pretty sure there was an answer but wasn't certain she had all the terms yet. The first time I really talked to Clara was in November. There'd been a cold snap that froze the water trough 2 nights running. I'd gotten up both mornings at 4 to break the ice before the horses got distressed. On the second morning, she was already there, lantern in one hand, hatchet in the other, coat buttoned to the throat. We worked without talking. Her at one end of the trough, me at the other, the lantern between us making a small, warm circle in the dark. When we were done, trough clear, horses watered, we stood for a minute in the quiet. Her breath was visible, mine too. She said, "You don't sleep much." "No. Bad dreams or just a bad conscience." She was watching the horses drink, not looking at me, more like thinking out loud. "Neither one," I said. "Been a long time since I slept somewhere long enough to get accustomed to it. A new place wakes me up." She was quiet for a moment. "My husband couldn't sleep either the last years," she said. "After the war, he'd be up half the night. I used to think something was wrong with him. Later, I thought it was something right, like he understood that time was shorter than it looked and he didn't want to sleep through any more of it than he had to." She picked up her lantern and went in, but something had shifted. Small, maybe. She'd told me something real without performance, and I'd heard it and we both knew it. After that, she talked more. Not dramatically more. Clara was not a dramatic person, but more. In the evenings after Ruth had gone to bed, we'd sometimes sit at the kitchen table. Her with her accounts and me with whatever I was repairing. And we'd talk the way two people talk when they're comfortable enough to be quiet between the sentences. She told me about buying this place with her husband 12 years back, when it had been a single paddock, and a hope of the stage contract that came 2 years later. About the first years, hard and beautiful in equal measure, the beauty mostly visible in retrospect. About the years after that, when it had just been hard, her husband getting sick and the work not letting up for illness. She talked about Ruth with a plain love that was entirely unsentimental, noting her stubbornness, and then in the same breath making it clear she thought Ruth was fundamentally good and would sort herself out. A grown-up way of loving someone. I told her less, about the claims work, about Cobb, about Denver. I didn't tell her about Francis. But I think she knew there was something there, the way you can tell a room had furniture even after it's been cleared. One evening in late November, she said, without any particular lead-up, "What are you going to do with that land near Raton?" I'd mentioned the deed once, weeks before. I'd almost forgotten she'd heard it. "Title's disputed. I'd need a lawyer to untangle it, and I don't have one." So I explained it, the foreman, the back wages, the deed offered as settlement, the lien he'd never mentioned. She listened without interruption. When I was done, she said, "That's a solvable problem. Maybe with the right lawyer. Or with the right information." She looked at her accounts. "I know the county clerk in Raton. I've done business with him for years." I looked at her. "Why would you involve yourself in that?" She set down her pencil. "Because you've put in 3 months of work here that I couldn't have done myself, and I don't like to see a man left without something solid to show for his life." She picked up the pencil, back to the numbers. I tried to remember the last time someone had said something like that to me. Not the words, the thing behind them, that my situation mattered to another person, that whether I had something solid or didn't had any weight in someone else's thinking. I couldn't find it. That's the honest answer. December. The storm came in the first week, 2 days of hard wind and snow that shut the road and kept us all inside. We managed the horses in shifts, pulling on coats and hats every 3 hours through the night to check water and feed, make sure nothing was in distress. On the second day in the afternoon, I was up in the hayloft pitching feed down through the chute when I heard voices below. Clara and Ruth. Not arguing, that wasn't Ruth's way exactly, but something with weight to it. "He's different," Ruth said, "from the ones who have come through before." "I know that," Clara said. "Are you going to say something to him about it?" A pause, the sound of a bucket being moved. Clara said, "You mind your own business, Ruth." "It is my business. It's our business what happens here. What happens to you?" Ruth's voice was careful in that way of someone who has thought about what she wants to say and is saying it anyway. "He's going to leave in the spring if nobody says anything." "People make their own choices," Clara said. "I'm not in the habit of trying to make them for someone else. Even when it's... Even then..." Silence for a moment. "I think he'd stay if he had a reason," Ruth said. "Then let's hope someone gives him one," Clara said. "Now help me with this feed." I stayed up in the hayloft longer than I needed to. That night at the kitchen table, we talked about the storm, the road, a mare who'd been favoring her right forefoot. Nothing else. But when she said goodnight, she stopped at the doorway and said, without turning all the way around, "I'm glad you stayed through the snow." I said I was glad to be of use. She turned just enough to look at me over her shoulder, and there was something in her expression, not sentiment in the soft sense, not anything that asked for a response. Something more settled than that. The expression of a person stating a thing they've decided is simply true. "That's not what I meant," she said. Then she was gone. I sat at that table for a long time. January came in hard. The road was impassable for nearly 2 weeks, too much snow, then a thaw, then another freeze that turned the packed surface into something that would hold a man on foot but not a loaded stage. Clara took it in stride. The station had reserves for exactly this situation. She'd built them up every fall, methodical, not gambling on a mild winter. We worked through the cold, the four of us in a rhythm. Me and Clara managing the heavier outdoor work, Ruth handling the kitchen and the lighter chores, all of us checking horses around the clock in the worst stretches. It was in those 2 weeks that I started to understand what it would mean to stay, not in the abstract. In the specific, physical sense. Waking in the same room every morning, knowing where everything was, knowing the temperament of every animal on the property, knowing which gate swung best if you lifted it 2 inches before you pushed. Knowing that if I came into the kitchen at a certain hour, Clara would have coffee on and would hand me a cup without being asked, and that she'd already looked at the sky and formed an opinion about the weather that was usually right. I'd lived solitary for a long time. Solitary has a particular texture, efficient in a certain way, like a bare room that's easy to clean but thin. Like eating plain food because you've forgotten you were allowed to want more. I was starting to notice the difference, which is why I started pulling back in the 3rd week of January. I know why. I've thought about it enough times that I'm honest with myself about it now. There is a particular kind of cowardice in a man who has been alone too long. He builds a life that fits exactly the shape of one person, and when something starts to fill out that shape, to change the dimensions of it, the cowardice wakes up. The cowardice says, "You are about to have something you can lose. Get out. Get out before you're in far enough that leaving hurts." Every leaving you make before it matters is a leaving you chose. Every leaving after it matters is one that happens to you. The cowardice prefers the first kind. I'm not proud of it. I'm just telling you it's what happened. I worked the same, if anything harder, because work was where I put the energy that was backing up. I fixed the last items on Clara's list and then started another list myself, things I'd noticed over the months, deferred maintenance she hadn't gotten to. I was useful in every practical sense, but at the kitchen table I got quieter. In the evenings I found reasons to turn in early. I stopped meeting her eyes the same way, not avoiding her exactly, but not seeking her out. She noticed. She would have noticed if I'd changed the way I breathed. She didn't say anything for about 2 weeks. I think she was deciding whether it was worth the trouble. What she did, eventually, on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of January with the wind hard outside and Ruth already gone up, was this. She put down her pencil, folded her hands on the table and said, "Tell me what happened with your wife." I looked at her. "You don't have to," she said, "but I've been wondering about it for a while and I'd like to know." So I told her. Not all of it, there were parts I still didn't have clear language for, parts that were as much my own failure as anything else, and I knew it even if I hadn't fully admitted it. But I told her the shape of it. Married at 29, Frances from Topeka, a good woman who'd believed a man could be reclaimed from his own habits by love. 3 years of patience. The empty house, the trunk that was never unpacked, the note on the table. Her letter from Montana. The particular quiet of a life that goes from 2 people to one so gradually you barely notice the departure. Clara listened without any expression I could name. When I was done, she said, "Did you love her?" I sat with that, tried to answer honestly. I think I loved who she was when I wasn't there to disappoint her, when she was an idea of home more than an actual presence I had to be present for. Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's an honest thing to say." "It's a bleak thing to say." "Yes," she said, "but honest is usually better than comfortable in the long run." We sat. Outside, the wind found the seam between the door and the frame and made its low particular note. I'd been meaning to repack that weather strip for a week. Clara said, "What are you afraid of exactly? Not in general, here." I turned the question over. It wasn't one I was accustomed to answering. But she was looking at me with that quality she had, not pressing, just entirely present, and I found I wanted to answer honestly. "Leaving something I'll spend the rest of my life regretting," I said finally, "or staying somewhere I'll eventually ruin." She looked at me for a long time. The lamp between us was low, and her face was mostly in the warm light on one side and shadow on the other. She said, "You're not as dangerous as you think you are, Tom." She said it plainly, with no softening around it. "You're a man who's been alone a long time and who built habits to manage that, and now the habits feel like identity and the identity feels like fate. But it isn't. It's just habits." She paused. "And I'm not as fragile as you seem to be afraid I might be. I've been managing this place alone since April, and I was managing most of it alone for 3 years before that. I know what hard looks like. You're not as hard as you think you are either." She picked up her pencil. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm not asking you to decide tonight or this week what your whole life is going to look like. I'm just telling you that there's a choice here, and I'd rather you made it looking at it clearly than running from it with your eyes shut." I went to bed. I lay there listening to the wind, to the familiar sounds of that house. The stove settling, a horse moving in the barn, the loose board I'd fixed on the east eave that was now silent instead of knocking. And I thought about what she'd said until the gray light came through the window. Then I got up and did the morning chores. February. Without telling me, Clara wrote a letter to the county clerk in Raton. I found out the way I found out most of what Clara had quietly done. After the fact, when the result of it appeared in front of me and couldn't be taken back. It came with the stage in the 3rd week of February. An envelope addressed to me, care of Clara Ames, Cimarron Crossing Station. I opened it at the kitchen table with Ruth looking on and Clara pointedly not looking on. Inside was a letter from a man named Aldrich, county clerk, Colfax County, New Mexico Territory. 3 pages precise. The substance. The lien on my parcel had been obtained fraudulently by the foreman, a man named Eddies, no longer in the territory, against land he'd had only partial title to. The lien holder had been aware for over a year that the underlying title was clouded and had been trying to find legitimate claimants. If I could document my claim, the original deed, evidence of wages owed, Aldrich believed the situation was resolvable without litigation. He knew the principles. He was willing to facilitate. I read it twice, then I looked up at Clara. "You wrote to Aldrich." "I did. Without telling me." She met my eyes. "You weren't going to do it yourself." It seemed wasteful. I set the letter down. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the basic facts of the situation and asked him to look into the county records. He did." She was calm, entirely calm in the way of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in relitigating it. "The information is accurate. I didn't invent it." I looked at the letter again. 3 pages. A solution handed to me by a woman who had acted on my behalf without my asking and without my permission, because she'd decided it was worth doing. What I felt, and I want to be accurate, was not only grateful. It was ambushed. Fear dressed up as indignation because indignation was easier to say out loud. If someone acts on your behalf without being asked, it means they thought about you when you weren't in the room. They decided you were worth the effort. A man who has spent years constructing a life in which he matters to no one can find that surprisingly difficult to receive. I stood up from the table. "I didn't ask you to get involved in my business, Clara." She didn't flinch. "No, you didn't. It's my problem to solve, my land." "It is," she said, "and now it's easier to solve." I couldn't fight that, so I said what I always said when I didn't know what else to say. "I'm going to go check on the mayor." I went out. I spent the rest of that day with my hands busy and my head full. I fixed a fence post that had been listing for a week. I reblocked the front wheels on the freight wagon. I swept the harness room, which didn't need sweeping. I made myself useful in the way I'd been making myself useful all winter, treating work as a destination, a place to go when everything else was too much. I worked myself by dinner into a grim resolution. Afterward, when Ruth had taken herself off to bed, I told Clara I'd be leaving in the spring, end of April or beginning of May, road conditions allowing. She looked at me. "All right," she said. "The Aldrich thing, I'll write him myself and take it from there. I appreciate what you did. You don't have to appreciate it. I'll pay you back for whatever the correspondence cost. It didn't cost anything, Tom. She looked at her accounts. If you've decided to leave, that's your decision. I went to bed. I lay there in the dark. The East Eve board I'd repaired in December was quiet. It had been quiet for 2 months, which I'd been satisfied about, and now the silence was just an absence where something used to be. I didn't sleep until close to morning. March. I stayed. The roads were still rough. Cobb needed a few more weeks of good feed. There were repairs I'd feel wrong leaving undone. All true, none of them why I stayed. Clara didn't mention my announced departure. Didn't ask if I'd reconsidered, didn't do anything different at all. We had our evenings at the kitchen table. We had the work. She was exactly as she'd always been. But something she'd said had gotten into me and was working on me, the way a stone in a boot eventually changes the way you walk. You're not as dangerous as you think you are. Habits, not identity. A choice you can make clear-eyed. I'd been turning those words over for 6 weeks and couldn't find the seam in them where they stopped being true. The thing that broke it open happened on a Saturday in the middle of March. It was cold still, that late-season cold that comes after you think winter has spent itself, the kind that's almost insulting. Clara had ridden out to check on a horse she'd sold to a small rancher named Beale, about 4 miles east along the river road. A routine check. The horse had been bought green, and she liked to follow up. She was supposed to be back by midday. By 2, she hadn't come. By 3, Ruth appeared in the barn doorway while I was working on a broken trace. She should have been back, Ruth said. I know. The road's not bad. I know, I set down the trace. How long do you usually wait before you'd go look? Ruth said immediately, I'd go now. I saddled Cobb. The river road was clear enough, some mud in the low spots, but nothing that would have stopped a horse. I rode east, not pushing, watching both sides of the road. I came over a shallow rise about 1.5 miles out and saw her below. She was sitting against the base of a cottonwood. Her horse was 20 yards off, grazing, reins trailing. He'd had time to settle down and start eating, which meant this had happened a while ago. Clara was sitting with her back against the tree and her hat in her lap and her left arm held against her chest. The angle of it was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough that I knew before I got down off Cobb what I was dealing with. I got down moving, got to her in about 5 strides. She looked up at me. Her face was pale, the kind of pale that comes from pain and shock, and she had that expression she always had, that set steadiness, except it was costing her something to maintain it now. She said in a voice that was entirely level, "Don't make a production of it." How long ago? Hour, maybe more. Horse spooked at a coyote. I came off on the side. Did you lose consciousness? No. Can you tell me where it hurts? She let me examine the arm. She held still for it, which cost her, I could see that. I ran my hands along the forearm carefully. The break was in the radius, about 4 inches above the wrist. Clean, I thought. The skin wasn't broken, the displacement wasn't bad, but that was a guess and not a trained one. Can you ride? If you'll help me up. I helped her up. She didn't lean on me more than she needed to, and she didn't make sounds about the pain. I caught her horse, tied him to my saddle, and we went back to the station. She rode straight-backed with her arm held against her body, and when I tried to slow the pace on a rough patch, she told me the pace was fine. Back at the station, Ruth saw us coming from the yard, read the situation immediately, and had the kitchen ready by the time we were inside. Clara sat at the table and told me, step by step, where the splinting materials were and how to apply them, talking me through the whole process in that same precise economy she brought to everything. I did what she told me. My hands were steadier than I would have expected. When it was done, arms splinted, bound, Ruth having retreated to give us a moment, Clara sat at the table and let herself be still. She was exhausted, I could see it, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding themselves together through pain and is now allowing herself to let go of the effort. I sat across from her. There was lamplight. Outside, a late-day wind had come up. I looked at her, this woman who had run a stage station alone since April, who had held herself together through a broken arm and a 4-mile ride, and a medical procedure she'd had to talk an untrained man through, who had sat at this table with me all winter and been honest and patient and real, who had written a letter to a county clerk on my behalf without asking anything in return. I said, I'm going to Raton. She looked at me, tired, but they're entirely there. When? Week or two, once the roads are reliably clear. I paused, to see Aldrich to settle the deed. She waited. And then I'm coming back, if you'll still have me. She looked at me for a long time. Her arm was on the table, and she was supporting it at the elbow with her good hand. And she looked tired in a way I hadn't seen in her before, not broken, but tired in the way of someone who has been careful for a long time, and was considering, maybe, the possibility of being less careful. She said, I told you I wasn't asking for promises. I know I'm not making one I can't keep. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. She looked at the lamp. You're going to go to Raton and then you're going to come back. That's what you're telling me. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, then simply, why? And that stopped me. Because there were easy answers, because you fixed my problem, because you were patient with me, because you're the most capable person I've met. All true and all insufficient. She deserved the honest one, and the honest one was harder to find words for, but I found them, or enough of them. Because you wrote a letter to a man I hadn't asked you to write to, and because you fixed something I'd been carrying for 2 years and made it look like nothing, and because when you told me I wasn't as dangerous as I thought I was, I lay awake until morning turning it over, and it's the truest thing anyone said to me in longer than I can account for. I stopped, and then I kept going. And because I am a better man in this place than I am anywhere else, not a different man. The same man, but able to be what I am without having to be on my way to something else. I don't know exactly what that means. But I know it's real, and I know it came from being here, and I know it came from you. Ruth came back in with water. Clara didn't say anything right away. She looked at me with the expression I'd learned to read over the winter, not the surface of her, but the thing underneath it. Something warm and careful and a little worn and entirely real. All right, Tom, she said. That was all. It was enough. I went to Raton in the first week of April. The roads were holding, cold mud from midnight until about 9 in the morning, firming up by midday, good enough for travel. I took Cobb and made it in 2 days, camping one night at the confluence of the Cimarron and a small feeder creek where there was good wood and a flat enough spot to sleep. Aldrich was a small, precise man in a gray wool suit who came out from behind his desk to shake my hand with both of his and said he was glad I'd finally come and that the whole Eddie's situation had been a mess from the beginning and that he was personally satisfied to see it getting untangled. We sat in his office for 3 hours. I had the original deed and the correspondence with Eddie's. He had the county records and what appeared to be a personal interest in doing this correctly. There was a legal fee, less than I'd feared. When the deed was clear and the lien discharged, and there was a new document on his desk with my name on it, and the county seal pressed into it, I sat for a moment and just looked at it. He pushed it toward me, I picked it up. 42 years old. A piece of land in Colfax County, clear title, good grass, decent water. A horse with a wall eye. And somewhere south on the Purgatoire Road, a woman who'd been carrying a place since April and who had decided, for reasons that still struck me as requiring more faith in me than I'd demonstrated warranted, that I was worth her patience. I folded the deed, 3 folds, same as always, pressed it into my coat pocket against my chest. Then I went and found Cobb and started back. I want to tell you about the ride back. It was not remarkable in any outward sense. 2 days on the Purgatoire Road, good weather, Cobb in a good mood. But it felt different from every other ride I'd taken in my life, and the difference was this. I was going toward something instead of away from it. That sounds small. It was not small. It was the thing I'd been avoiding for the better part of 20 years without knowing exactly what I was avoiding. A direction that was about arrival rather than departure. I came down the Purgatoire Road in the early morning of the second day, just after first light. The valley was in that particular spring clarity that you get in the high desert when the air is still cold, but the sun is already strong. Everything edged sharp. The cottonwoods along the river with their new leaves catching the light. The bluffs to the east going from gray to orange as the sun came up. The station house was below me on the flat. Smoke from the kitchen chimney going straight up in still air. Horses already moving in the near paddock. The gates I'd rebuilt last fall standing square and level. The north wall of the house that I'd worked on, the stucco I'd mixed and set, was curring lighter than the old, still visible as a patch, probably needed one more coat to match. The drainage channel on the north side, invisible from here, but I knew it was there, water moving the way it was supposed to. Clara was at the near gate. She was doing something with the latch, checking it, adjusting it, the ordinary morning maintenance of a working property. She hadn't seen me yet. She had her brown coat on and her hair back the way she wore it in the morning. Just a woman at a gate in the early light doing ordinary work. I stopped Cobb on the rise and watched her. There is something about seeing a person in a place where they belong, doing small practical things, unobserved, not performing anything for anyone, that will get into you in a way no grand moment ever could. She was just there, real and specific and present in that particular spot on that particular morning, in the way you can only be when a place is yours and you've built it and you're responsible for it and it's home. I started down. She heard Cobb's hooves on the road when I was about 100 yards out and turned. She watched me come without moving, just stood at the gate with her hand still on the latch and watched me ride down. When I got close enough to see her face clearly, she had the expression of a person who has been hoping for something and is now watching it walk toward her. Not surprise, not relief exactly, something more settled than either of those, something that had been waiting to be confirmed. I stopped Cobb at the gate. She said, "How was Raton?" "Cold still at night." Aldrich was straightforward. "I thought he would be." "Deed's clear." "Good," she said it plain, like she'd known it would be. Like she decided that it would be and therefore it was. I stepped down off Cobb. We were close now, the gate between us, and I reached over and worked the latch she'd just been adjusting, and it moved cleanly, the way a well-hung gate should, and pushed it open. She put her hand against the front of my coat. Flat, steady, right where the deed was folded inside the pocket. She didn't pull me toward her. She just put her hand there and looked up at me. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." "You did." I put my hand over hers. Her hand was cold from the morning air, and I held it there between my palm and my coat, and she didn't look away. From the house, Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway. She took one look at the yard and went back inside without a word. We stood there in the early light, with the horses moving behind us and the smoke going straight up from the chimney, and her hand warm now under mine against my chest. The new leaves on the cottonwood by the gate were making a small sound in a breeze I could barely feel. "I need to figure out what to do with that land," I said, eventually, when I could trust my voice to sound normal about it. "You've got time now," she said. I did, that was the thing. For the first time in a long time I had time, and I was in one place, and there was someone beside me who I was not planning to leave. That was 12 years ago. The land in Colfax County we put to summer grazing. I run cattle there from May to October, drive them back to Clara's pastures for winter. It's a good arrangement. The land is good land once you know it. Clara's place and mine are adjacent now on paper, which is a piece of geography I arranged deliberately, and which she noticed immediately and said nothing about, which is how she handled the things she was glad about but had decided not to be sentimental over. Ruth married a young man from Cimarron in the spring of '93. He's a carpenter, steady, and he looks at her the way a man should look at a woman he's chosen. They have a daughter, 2 years old now, who has Ruth's eyes and what appears so far to be Ruth's opinion of everything, which is formidable and probably correct. Clara goes to see them about once a month. I drive her when the roads are good, and she doesn't pretend she doesn't prefer it to going alone. Cobb died in the winter of '94. I buried him in the east pasture where the grass is best in summer and the ground is soft enough to dig without too much trouble. I felt foolish about how hard it was doing it. He was a horse, and I'm not a sentimental man, and yet. Clara came out when I was done and didn't say anything about it. She put her hand on my back and stood there with me for a while. That's her, that's who she is. Not soft about things in a way that would embarrass either of us. Just present, just certain always of what the moment needs. I think about that winter sometimes. I think about the man who'd folded a bad deed into his coat and walked out of kitchens before dawn for years, because staying was the one thing he hadn't learned how to do. I think about the year that almost finished that particular piece of work. A man at 42, all his habits intact and all his company gone, with a wall-eyed horse and a disputed deed and nothing much else to show for it. About how easily I could have kept writing. And then I think about a letter written to a county clerk. About a woman saying you're not as dangerous as you think you are. About a hand flat against a man's coat in the early morning light and the word enough and time to be in one place. There are men who spend their lives moving and call it freedom. I was that man for a long time, and I know what it is. It is freedom of a kind, the freedom of a man who carries nothing he can lose. It is also poverty of a kind. The kind you don't see until someone shows you what you've been refusing. I was shown. I'm still not sure what I did to deserve it. I've thought about it for 12 years and I still can't account for it. I just know that she saw something worth seeing in me before I could see it in myself, and she held on to that seeing, and she waited with the patience of a woman who has run a stage station alone and knows exactly how long the hard things take, and eventually I stopped running and looked back. She was there. She was still there. The deed sits in the top drawer of the desk now, still folded 3 times, still worn soft along the creases. I stopped pressing my hand against it a long time ago. There's no need. It isn't something I'm about to lose. Neither is she. And